Today we are going to be discussing some good people in history that you didn't realize did some real horrible things. Hello everyone and welcome back to our channel. I'm your host Emily and today we're counting down our list of the top 10 evil people who disguise themselves as saints. Coming in at number 10 is Mother Teresa. Mother Teresa was an Albanian Catholic nun and the founder of Missionaries of Charity. Now everyone thought this woman was a saint helping the sick and poor, but as reported by the Times of India, Mother Teresa's true motives were actually kind of selfish, with less focus on helping people and more on boosting the numbers for her own religion. Now Mother Teresa's missions, despite having tons of charitable donations at their disposals, rarely if ever helped the poor sick people become healthy. In fact, most of those places, according to a 2013 paper published in Studies in Religion, were dirty, short on doctors, low on food, and didn't even have painkillers. Now nevertheless, Teresa found suffering beautiful, like it was making the world a better, holier place. She said, "There is something beautiful in seeing the poor accept their lot, to suffer it like Christ's passion. The world gains much from their suffering." But then when she got sick, she went to a modern hospital and received medicine to dull her pain as she didn't want to suffer. Kinda backwards, isn't it? Number 9. Mahatma Gandhi. Mahatma Gandhi inspired movements for civil rights and freedom across the world, but most of us don't know that Gandhi abandoned his wife to live with a rich male bodybuilder before he got involved in British-Indian relations. Now, if Gandhi was gay, who cares? But the problem is he tried to get all references to homosexual traditions erased from Indian temples in an act he called sexual cleansing. And to test his resistance to sexual temptation, he'd sleep in bed naked with young women, including his grandnieces. Yeah, gross. But worse than his sexual hypocrisy was his terrible racism. Gandhi may have wanted India freed from British rule, but he was perfectly happy with the rigid caste system of the nation. Gandhi wrote of a time when he and his followers were led to a lower caste jail for protesting. "We could understand not being classed with the whites, but to be placed on the same level as the natives seemed too much to put up with. They are as a rule uncivilized, the convicts even more so. They're troublesome, very dirty, and live like animals," he said. Now, when asked about Indian views on race versus white South Africans, he wrote, "We believe as much in the purity of races as we think they do. Though Gandhi did bring some good to the world, it's important to know that he wasn't as great as he seemed." Number 8. Pablo Picasso. Pablo Picasso was a Spanish painter, sculptor, printmaker, and theater designer who spent most of his adult life in France. He is one of the most influential artists of the 20th century, but it seems like the only good thing he did for the world was create art. His granddaughter Marina Picasso wrote of his treatment of women. Once they were bled dry, he would dispose of them. The Guardian reported that 45-year-old Picasso enjoyed watching underage Marie-Therese Walter, with whom he had a sexual relationship with, physically fight his other girlfriend, surrealist photographer Dora Maar, who was 30 years his junior. Now he also drew pictures that showed someone who looked a lot like Marie-Therese being mistreated by a minotaur figure that represented himself. Now according to Paris Review, he told his mistress after Dora, artist Francois Gillet, "Women are machines for suffering." Now he also threatened to throw Francois from a bridge, who was 21 years old at the time, and Picasso was 65 when they began their affair. Now after they broke up, Picasso tried to ruin her reputation, but Francois was undeterred. Now she later wrote a searing memoir about their relationship, and due to their relationships with him, Marie-Therese took her own life, as did Picasso's second wife, Jacqueline. Number 7. Coco Chanel. Coco Chanel is one of the world's most influential fashion empires, named after the famous French designer who originally founded the company. Chanel liked the high life and it was known to associate with British aristocrats, French politicians, and German military officers in Paris during the Second World War. Now when the war broke out, Chanel secured lodging at Paris Ritz, and after the fall of France, many officers ended up living there as well, where she had many different relationships with them. Now it's said that Coco Chanel was more than likely a spy for Germany, as the evidence appears to skew strongly in favor of Chanel at least doing some information gathering for the National Socialists. Apparently, as business savvy as she was anti-Semitic, Chanel possibly took advantage of the Germans' anti-Semitic laws. After the Germans retreated from Paris in 1944, Chanel was under investigation as a collaborator, but a lack of evidence at the time prevented her prosecution. Now according to Newsweek, some historians have suggested that one of Chanel's high-profile pals, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, intervened on her behalf. Number 6. Henry Ford. Henry Ford was one of America's greatest entrepreneurs and innovators, a man who literally changed the world. Now, he not only transformed the way people could get around by selling cars everyone could afford, but Ford also revolutionized the industry by creating the moving assembly line. Now, this was amazing, but Henry also hated Jewish people. As even the Henry Ford Museum says, Ford's anti-Jewish sentiments ran deep. Now, he bought a local newspaper in 1918, the Dearborn Independent. 2 years later, the Independent began publishing Ford's anti-Semitic views. He would later publish his Jew-bashing articles together as The International Jew, the World's Foremost Problem, which would go on to sell millions of copies and be translated into a dozen languages. Now, to make things worse, that certain German leader, who I cannot name, referred to Ford as the only man in America uncorrupted by Jews, saying only a single great man, Ford, to their fury, has maintained full independence. Now, that leader also gave an interview to a Detroit news reporter in 1931, and the reporter asked him about the large portrait of Ford the soon-to-be dictator had in his office. "I regard Henry Ford as my inspiration," was the reply. Now, if that isn't the biggest red flag, I don't know what is. Number 5. Steve Jobs. Steve Jobs changed all of our lives with Apple, but he was actually part of many other companies. He was the co-founder, chairman, and CEO of Apple, the chairman and majority shareholder of Pixar, a member of the Walt Disney Company's board of directors following its acquisition of Pixar, and the founder, chairman, and CEO of Next. Though he accomplished great things, he wasn't a great guy. He fathered a daughter but denied that she was his, so she didn't see him for years. Now, he contracted Apple with Chinese factories whose conditions were so bad that they drove workers to exhaustion, as several wound up ending their own lives over the breakneck pace they were expected to churn out iPads and iPhones, among other devices. Now, there was also an issue with Apple's stocks in that Steve was allegedly illegally backdating them in hopes of cashing in. When questioned about it by the Securities and Exchange Commission, he first denied it, then said he had to ask Apple's boards of directors for an extra thank you stock, and then later turned the blame on his chief financial officer. Number 4. Walt Disney. Although Walt Disney all played a part in our childhoods, whether it was from watching his movies or going to the theme parks, there's no denying that he was also a bad man. You see, Walt was just straight up racist, and not because he let the Song of the South be made. He would often use slurs and degrade people of color. Now, his hatred didn't stop there, as he also had issues with women. As Ward Kimball, one of Disney's associates, said, he didn't trust women or cats. Then there's a letter Disney sent to a woman named Mary Ford who wanted to work as an animator. He rejected her outright because women simply don't do that kind of work for him. In the letter's own words, women do not do any of the creative work, as that work is performed entirely by young men. For this reason, girls are not considered for the training school, he said. So just think about that next time you see anything related to the man who made Mickey Mouse. Number 3. Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill was a British statesman, soldier, and writer who served as Prime Minister of the United Kingdom twice from 1940 to 1945, and again from 1951 to 1955. Now, we know him for his efforts against fighting the Germans during World War II, but as it turns out, he was a white supremacist who had way more in common with his enemies than history wants to let on. According to Richard Toye's book Churchill's Empire, young Churchill took part in what he called a lot of jolly little wars against barbarous peoples in Africa, and believed they were violent against the British not because the Brits were invading their land, but because they had a strong aboriginal propensity to kill. Later, when he joined Parliament, Churchill advocated war against minorities, and then there was Gandhi's quest to free India from British rule. Now, Churchill didn't like that, calling for Gandhi's death shortly after he rose to prominence in the late 1920s. Now, it wasn't just Gandhi though, as Churchill openly admitted, "I hate Indians. They are beastly people with a beastly religion." In 1943, in between speeches about never surrendering, he refused to help India survive a severe famine that ultimately ended the lives of around 3 million people. Now, Churchill blamed the Indians, saying it was all their fault for breeding like rabbits. Number 2. Thomas Jefferson. Although Thomas Jefferson publicly claimed to oppose slavery, The Guardian reports that he personally enslaved 607 people throughout his life, freeing only 5, and only after his death via his will. Jefferson spoke out against slavery on a political and intellectual level. He not only described it as moral depravity, he labeled it one of the most destructive forces facing the newly formed America. He tried to introduce legislation that he believed would eventually lead to the end of slavery. Jefferson argued that a gradual approach to emancipation was necessary, and that white people were naturally superior to black people. Now, one of the most infamous aspects of Jefferson's history as a slaveholder is his relationship with Sally Hemings, an enslaved person at Monticello whom he had at least 6 children with. This was first made public in a newspaper in 1802, although it had already been known by Sally's descendants and was confirmed by DNA in 1998. Now, some people like to romanticize the Hemings-Jefferson relationship, but the fact that Sally, who was a teenager when then 40-something Jefferson initiated their sexual relationship, was not free to decide whether it happened or not. And coming in at number 1 is Dr. Seuss. Dr. Seuss was an American children's author and cartoonist, and he's known for his work writing and illustrating more than 60 books. Personally, my favorite book of his is Oh, the Places You'll Go, but as he wrote these books, he also had a dark side. Dr. Seuss, like many Americans during World War II, contributed to the war effort in his own way by creating racist propaganda that attacked American Japanese enemies. Seuss was contracted by the government to produce educational cartoons for the troops, and for this he was given full artistic license. Much of his material depicted the Japanese with horrifically offensive caricatures, and the messages they contained were problematic. Now, World War II wasn't the only occasion for which Dr. Seuss produced racist cartoons, as he continued on making offensive drawings of African and Chinese people. Now, besides being racist, he also treated his wife horribly. Throughout the course of their 40-year marriage, his wife Helen struggled repeatedly with her health, and for more than a decade leading up to her death, she was partially paralyzed. Now, at the time of her passing in 1967, she was stricken with cancer, and rather than, I don't know, standing by his wife, Seuss began an affair with Audrey Stone Diamond. Now, the affair left Helen absolutely heartbroken and ultimately contributed to her death. Shortly after Helen learned of her husband's affair, the couple's longtime housekeeper found Helen's lifeless body with an empty prescription pill bottle nearby. Ultimately, Dr. Seuss's cruel infidelity in the face of his wife's illness caused her to take her own life. So yeah, just think about that the next time you watch The Grinch at Christmas time. Well, that's all for our list of the top 10 evil people who disguise themselves as saints. Who in our list shocked you the most? Let us know in the comments down below, and don't forget to like and subscribe while you're down there. I'm your host Emily, and we'll see you next time. Peace.